The Labor review released late yesterday found that 3 things went wrong for Labor at the last election. 1, there were too many policies that were deemed too risky. Secondly, Bill Shorten was unpopular. And thirdly, Labor failed to adopt a change in the Liberal leadership when Scott Morrison took over from Malcolm Turnbull. Do you agree with this outcome?
Look, I'm not in the business of questioning the review. I think the review is some very thorough work by some people I highly respect, including a Western Australian, Linda O'Sharlam, who was someone I worked with very closely here in the West a few years back. It's a good review. It does hold a mirror to what went wrong for Labor. It's not comfortable reading for anyone in the Labor Party. But I agree with the review, and I think the real challenge now is for Labor to implement the review. The reality is there are stacks and stacks of reviews done into elections that Labor's lost, and in my view, we've lost too many, but we haven't implemented all of those recommendations. So the real test for us now is, do we implement the review that's been given to us?
Bill Shorten issued a statement yesterday where he said he intended to be around for the next 20 years. We all know Bill Shorten is very ambitious. Do you think this review and the election result rules out Shorten returning to the Labor leadership over the next 20 years?
Well, Bill himself has ruled out that very prospect, so I think that kind of answers that question. He said he wants to continue to play a role. There are good examples of people who have not been successful in an election going on to play important roles in governments of both Labor and Liberal persuasions. It's a tough time for Bill. I mean, the reality is it's a tough time for everyone in the Labor family. We didn't do what we set out to do at the start of the year, but we spectacularly failed. And one of the things that really hurts me in reading that review is that we lost because of things that were within our control. It wasn't global factors, it wasn't just things done by other political parties, it was because our campaign administration wasn't strong enough. We didn't have a clear strategy. We had policies that were out of sequence and didn't connect together. So the real lesson for all of us is that we lost because of things within our control, and that hurts, but it's what happened. It's the truth.
And not just the sequence of policies, but very unpopular policies. But I'm going to get to that in a moment. I just want to finish dealing with Bill Shorten. The review cited his unpopularity as one of the 3 crucial reasons that Labor lost. But in Shorten's statement that he released yesterday, he mentioned franking credits and Clive Palmer's advertising spend as big reasons. Do you think he's taking any responsibility or enough responsibility for this loss, or is he trying to shift the blame?
I think Bill has taken responsibility, and the reality is he was the front and centre of that election campaign, and we very publicly lost on the 18th of May. There is no way that Bill or any of us in the Labor team can avoid our different pieces of responsibility. But I don't believe in criticising former leaders. I think you actually go, Bill did some really amazing work over 6 years, repairing relationships within the Labor Party, getting us into a much more competitive position than we were. Indeed, I faced 2 elections with Bill as leader, the by-election in Perth last year and obviously the general election this year. I won both of those elections, and indeed we had a very good, small but statistically significant swing towards us in Perth on the 18th of May. So I don't believe in allocating blame just to a leader. I think Bill's already paid the ultimate political price, which is that he stood at an election to be Prime Minister and he lost.
A crucial thing now for Labor is, of course, the policy direction. And this is where I think the Labor review gets very interesting. I'm just going to read you one line from it. It says that working people experiencing the dislocation caused by new technologies and globalisation could lose faith in Labor if they do not believe Labor is responding to their issues, but is focusing on issues not of concern to them, or in some cases are actively against their interest. Is Labor having an identity crisis here?
I don't believe we're having an identity crisis, but I think it's an acknowledgement of the huge challenges that confront any government, Labor or Liberal. There was one study put out earlier this year that said that some 5 million jobs in Australia will disappear due to automation and technological advances in the next 10 to 15 years. That's about 40% of the workforce. Like, these changes are happening. Over the next 2 years, you're going to see thousands and thousands of jobs change or indeed disappear because of technology and automation. One of the challenges I think for us now is to make sure that we also, while we think about what Labor's approach to some of those challenges would be, we also hold the government to account. Because sometimes what I hear from the Morrison government is just, oh, well, that's the economy doing what the economy does. And on the Labor side, we will always advocate for governments managing those transitions. That's what Bob Hawke did so well with his economic reforms, was that you saw these huge changes in how the world was coming together, and they managed it in the interests of working people. That's the Labor approach. I don't think that changes. That's a key part of our identity. But it's getting, these changes are going to be really hard to manage, not just in Australia, but across the globe.
And that was one of the areas where Labor did really poorly. You know, Labor lost its core constituents, the working class. You know, you're in WA, of course. Mining workers abandoned Labor, for example, because they felt that Labor, and the review said this as well, Labor was becoming the party of inner city, you know, greeny type people who and catering for, as I would like to put it, causes of the comfortable. And the review did find that Labor was now servicing more affluent people who could, you know, afford to pay higher taxes for a cause like climate change, for example. The review referenced competing constituencies when you have this working class and the affluent inner city constituents as well. How does Labor possibly, moving forward, have a set of policies that can cater for both of these constituencies?
Well, what I saw in Anthony Albanese's speech to the National Press Club today was he was really clear on reminding people you've got to be a party of government. Being a party of government rather than a party of protest or a party of, you know, advocating for self-interested interest groups is a challenge. It means that you've actually got to think about the national interest every single policy that you look across. It's hard, and when it comes to where people felt, and ultimately elections are also about emotions, and if people feel that you're not actually going to stand up for them, not actually going to have their interests at heart, then they won't vote for you. And I think that's something we've got to acknowledge as well, is that I believe the policies that Labor took to the election were genuinely formulated with the interests of working and lower income Australians at its heart. But we communicated those terribly, and those voters didn't feel like we were actually on their side. So that's the lesson that we have to learn. You know, we had a fairer tax plan that would have put more money into working people's pockets than is happening today. That would have been a good thing. But people didn't have that sense that, and elections are about emotions, and people's emotions and the way that they felt about Labor's policies was they didn't think it was the right choice for them, and they chose not to vote for us. So we've got to take that feedback.
The discussion about policies ahead of the election, according to the review, was limited to the leadership group, and frank and open discussion wasn't encouraged within the party. Your background, for example, as having worked for Kevin Rudd, would have been valuable. Was your input ever sought?
Well, you always have. Look, I'm a junior backbencher. You always probably think that you should have more of a say. One of the lessons I learned out of this election was that you sometimes assume that there's smart people making rational decisions and thoroughly testing things somewhere else. What you see in this review is the reality was there was no campaign committee. It was centralised in the shadow cabinet. Differing views weren't sought. So, like, that's a fact. Like, I would have, of course, many of us would have done things differently to the way that they played out. But there was a lack of that collegiate campaigning knowledge being brought together. And I think the review, I was shocked. One of the things that did surprise me in the review was when I picked it up and it said very explicitly there was no written strategy, there was no campaign committee. I mean, seriously, like that is unacceptable and unforgivable.
Isn't that
things like that?
The fact that there wasn't even a strategy, though, isn't that because Labor, Bill Shorten and his team were so arrogant and so confident that they were going to win that they didn't think they needed a campaign strategy?
Yeah, I don't necessarily agree with that, that there was arrogance or overconfidence. I think the review did clearly say that we put too much faith into public polls and we didn't listen enough to the polls that we now know was telling us that Labor was behind. I think Bill worked really hard. You can't criticise his effort over 6 years trying to get Labor back in front. And here in the West, we were at historic lows, sort of 2010, 2013, only had 3 seats. Bill, 2016, he won 2 seats and won us an extra Senate spot. So some of that sort of idea of complacency I don't necessarily agree with, but we were structurally, we set ourselves up for failure in the way that we ran our campaign. And that's why I say the most heartbreaking thing about this review is that the reality is we lost because of things within Labor's control. It wasn't external factors, it was things that we could have done differently.
Patrick, Labor pitches itself as a progressive and family-friendly party, and it definitely pitches itself as the more family-friendly out of the two parties. But in your personal pre-selection process, you were questioned about whether you would be able to do the job of representing the electorate of Perth because you had a new baby. How is this acceptable?
Yeah. Look, it's not, and I've always been really clear on that. We need people with no kids, grandkids, young kids, old kids. We need the whole diversity of the community in the parliament. And everyone, it's a unique and privileged role to play in your communities, to be a local MP. It's not something that should be determined by your family circumstance. I have always said I'll very proudly be a dad and a parent in the parliament. That influences how I approach all sorts of policy challenges, like how do we invest in Medicare, early childhood education, school funding policy. Those things are important to me. But yeah, look, I think the party is going on a journey. And also, just to come back to the review, one of the things in the review, which I think is a really important recommendation and has kind of been lost in the debate, is that there weren't enough women in senior leadership roles in our campaign teams across the country. And I just think that's something that I was really pleased to see in the review, is that if we want to win, and it's known that without a strong vote from the women of Australia, Labor can't form government. If we don't have more women in leadership roles in our party, then we're going to stay in opposition for another 10 years.